The distant rumble of thunder echoed across the vast Montana territory as Violet Blackburn stumbled through the underbrush, one hand clutching her swollen belly, the other bracing against a pine tree as another wave of dizziness threatened to overcome her. It was 1873, and at 7 months pregnant, she had no business traveling alone through this unforgiving wilderness. But circumstances had forced her hand, and now she was paying the price. Just a little further, she whispered to herself, though she had no idea where she was headed. Her provisions had run out 2 days ago, and the last trickle from her canteen had wet her parched lips that morning. The baby kicked inside her, as if sensing her distress. Violet had been on the run since her husband's murder 3 weeks prior. Thomas hadn't been much of a husband, a gambler and a drunk who'd left her to fend for herself most days, but he hadn't deserved a bullet in the back over a card game. The same men who'd killed him had burned their small homestead to the ground, forcing her to flee with nothing but the clothes on her back and a locket containing a picture of her mother. The sky darkened as she pushed forward, her legs growing heavier with each step. When the first drops of rain began to fall, Violet looked desperately for shelter. Instead, her foot caught on an exposed root, sending her tumbling down a steep embankment. She rolled, trying to protect her belly, before coming to a stop at the bottom. The world spun around her as she tried to push herself up, her vision blurred, darkness creeping in at the edges. The last thing she saw before consciousness slipped away was the warm glow of campfires in the distance. Mason Northcott knew trouble when he saw it, and the Blacksnake Gang's camp in the valley below was nothing but. He'd been tracking this particular group of outlaws for nearly 6 months, ever since they'd robbed the bank in Silver Creek and killed the sheriff, Mason's mentor and friend. From his vantage point on the ridge, Mason counted 8 men around 3 campfires. Their leader, Jacob "Snake" Wilson, sat by the largest fire, cleaning his revolver. Mason had nearly caught up to them twice before, but they'd always managed to slip away. This time would be different. He was about to retreat and make plans to approach the camp after nightfall when movement at the edge of the clearing caught his eye. A woman, clearly pregnant, stumbled from the tree line before collapsing. Even from this distance, Mason could see she wasn't part of the gang. The outlaws hadn't noticed her yet, but it would only be a matter of time. "Damn it all," he muttered, adjusting his hat against the increasing rainfall. His mission had just gotten considerably more complicated. Violet awoke to rough hands shaking her shoulder and the acrid smell of cheap whiskey. Her eyes flew open to find a weathered, unshaven face peering down at her. "Well, look what we got here, boys," the man called over his shoulder. "A little lady come to pay us a visit." Fear shot through Violet as she became aware of her surroundings. She was in a camp with at least 7 or 8 men, all with the hard, dangerous look of outlaws. Instinctively, she curled her arms around her belly. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I mean no harm. I got lost and fell. If you could spare some water," she says. The man laughed, revealing blackened teeth. "I reckon we can spare more than water for such a pretty little thing." His eyes traveled down to her swollen midsection. "Though someone's been there before us, ain't they?" The other men gathered around, a mix of amusement and something more predatory in their expressions. One man, taller than the others with a snake tattoo visible at his collar, stepped forward. "That's enough, Hank," he said sharply. "Can't you see she's about ready to pop that baby out?" He crouched down beside Violet, offering a canteen. "Drink slow. Name's Jacob Wilson. These are my boys." Violet accepted the water gratefully, though she didn't trust the man's sudden kindness. There was a coldness in his eyes that made her skin crawl. "Violet Blackburn," she said after taking a careful sip. "I'm trying to reach Fort Benton. My sister lives there." Wilson nodded thoughtfully. "Fort Benton's a good 4 days' ride from here, madam. And you don't look in any condition to be making that journey." "I don't have much choice," Violet said, struggling to sit up straighter. Wilson exchanged glances with a few of his men. "Well, you can rest here tonight. We'll figure something out in the morning." Violet knew she should refuse, but exhaustion and hunger had worn her down. She needed rest, food, and time to figure out a plan. "Thank you," she said cautiously. As the outlaws returned to their campfires, Violet caught sight of a man hovering at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden in shadow. He wore a dark hat pulled low, and a badge glinted briefly on his vest before he disappeared back into the trees. Her heart raced a lawman, so close. But was he friend or foe? And what would these outlaws do if they discovered him? Mason watched from the trees as the woman was given water and a place by one of the fires. It was a stroke of luck she hadn't been harmed immediately, but he knew the Black Snake gang well enough to know their hospitality wouldn't last. Snake Wilson was notorious for his cruelty, especially toward women. He needed to get her out of there, but charging in would only get them both killed. Mason retreated deeper into the forest to think. The woman was clearly exhausted and in no condition to run. He'd need to create a diversion and somehow get to her without being seen. As darkness fell completely, the rain intensified, drowning out most sounds and limiting visibility. It wasn't ideal, but it might provide the cover he needed. Mason secured his horse further back in the trees before carefully making his way down to the edge of the camp. The outlaws had taken shelter under crude lean-tos, leaving only 2 men on watch. The pregnant woman was huddled under an oilskin near the smallest fire, visibly shivering despite the cover. He waited until the guards were positioned on opposite sides of the camp before making his move. Keeping low, Mason crept toward the woman, freezing whenever one of the guards turned in his direction. The rain and darkness were both blessing and curse. They concealed his approach, but made the terrain treacherous. When he was within a few feet of her, Mason made a soft clicking sound. The woman's head jerked up, fear evident in her eyes until she recognized him as the man she'd glimpsed earlier. He placed a finger to his lips and motioned for her to stay still. Violet had been unable to sleep, fear and discomfort keeping her awake despite her exhaustion. When she heard the quiet sound and looked up to see the man with the badge, hope and terror warred within her. He could be her salvation or her doom. He crawled the last few feet to her side, leaning close to whisper in her ear. "My name's Mason Northcott, madam. U.S. Marshal. I'm going to get you out of here, but you need to trust me and do exactly as I say." Violet nodded, clutching her belly as the baby shifted restlessly. "They killed my husband," she whispered back. "I think they're the same men." Mason's expression hardened momentarily before he nodded. "Can you walk?" "I think so, but not quickly," Violet admitted. "Then I'll carry you. When I create a diversion on the far side of camp, I need you to crawl toward those rocks." He pointed to an outcropping about 20 feet away. "I'll meet you there." Before Violet could respond, Mason was gone, slipping away into the darkness. She waited, heart pounding, watching the 2 guards pace their routes. A few minutes later, a series of loud crashes and animal-like howls erupted from the far side of the camp. "What the hell was that?" one of the guards shouted, raising his rifle. "Probably just a mountain lion," the other replied, though he sounded uncertain. "Check it out," came Wilson's voice from one of the shelters. As both guards moved toward the disturbance, Violet seized her chance. She crawled on hands and knees toward the rocks, each movement sending pain through her lower back. The baby seemed to sense her distress, kicking forcefully against her ribs. Violet bit her lip to keep from crying out. She had just reached the rocks when a shout went up from the camp. "The woman's gone. Find her," Wilson bellowed. Suddenly, strong arms encircled her, and Violet found herself being lifted. Mason held her against his chest, his expression grim in the faint moonlight that occasionally broke through the clouds. "Hold tight," he instructed, and then he was running, carrying her weight as if she were nothing more than a child. Behind them, lanterns flared to life in the camp, and angry voices called out. The first gunshot cracked through the night, wide of its mark but close enough to send a spray of bark from a nearby tree. Mason didn't slow, navigating the treacherous terrain with surprising grace despite his burden. Violet clung to him, face pressed against his rain-slicked coat, praying for their safety and that of her unborn child. More gunshots followed, and Violet felt Mason stumble once before regaining his stride. "Are you hit?" she gasped. "Just a graze," he grunted, not breaking his pace. "My horse is just ahead." The rain was coming down in sheets now, making visibility almost non-existent. Violet could hear the outlaws crashing through the underbrush behind them, spreading out to try to cut off their escape. Mason finally slowed as they reached a large oak where a sturdy chestnut gelding waited, stomping nervously at the sound of pursuit. In one fluid motion, Mason lifted Violet onto the saddle before swinging up behind her. "Hold on to the pommel," he instructed, reaching around her to grab the reins. "Samson's sure-footed, but this is going to be a rough ride." The horse leapt forward as Mason dug his heels in, nearly unseating Violet. She clutched the pommel desperately with one hand, the other still protectively curved around her belly. Behind them, the shouts grew fainter as they put distance between themselves and the outlaw camp. But Violet knew men like Wilson wouldn't give up easily. They'd be pursued, and in her condition, she was a severe liability to this marshal who'd risked his life to save her. For hours they rode through the driving rain, Mason steering them through narrow canyons and across shallow streams, doubling back occasionally to confuse their trail. Violet fought to stay conscious, the pain in her back increasing with each jolt of the horse's gait. As dawn broke, the rain finally began to taper off. Mason guided the horse into a small cave formed by a rocky overhang and helped Violet dismount. She swayed on her feet, and he quickly steadied her. "We need to rest," he said, looking at her with concern. "You're dead on your feet, and Samson needs a break." "What about the outlaws?" Violet asked, her voice weak. "We've put enough distance between us, and the rain will have washed away our tracks. They won't find us here." Mason helped her sit on a relatively flat rock before retrieving a saddlebag and extracting some jerky and a full canteen. Violet accepted the food and water gratefully. Now that they were stationary and her fear was subsiding, she could properly look at her rescuer. Mason Northcott was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30, with intelligent blue eyes and a strong jawline partly obscured by several days' growth of beard. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to handling himself in dangerous situations. "Why did you help me?" she asked finally. Mason busied himself checking his horse's hooves. "It's my job, madam. I've been tracking the Blacksnake gang for months. They're wanted for multiple robberies and murders across 3 territories. Including my husband's, I believe," Violet said quietly. Mason turned to look at her fully. "I'm sorry for your loss." Violet nodded, unsure how to explain that while Thomas's death had been tragic, their marriage had been far from happy. "He wasn't a good man," she found herself saying. "But he didn't deserve to die like that." Mason seemed to understand what she wasn't saying. He knelt beside her, checking her for injuries. "Are you hurt anywhere?" "The baby. I think we're both all right," Violet said, though her back continued to ache. "Just exhausted. You should try to sleep. I'll keep watch." Violet wanted to protest, but exhaustion won out. She curled onto her side on the blanket Mason provided, and despite the hard ground and her precarious situation, she fell into a deep sleep. Mason watched the pregnant woman sleep, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the way her hand remained protectively over her belly even in slumber. He'd seen enough suffering in his years as a marshal to recognize a woman who'd endured more than her fair share. He examined the graze on his arm, where one of the outlaw's bullets had caught him. It wasn't deep, but it stung fiercely. Using water from his canteen, he cleaned the wound before binding it with a strip of relatively clean cloth. His mind raced with plans. They were still at least 3 days' ride from the nearest settlement, and the woman Violet was in no condition for such a journey. Yet they couldn't stay here indefinitely. The Blacksnake gang might have lost their trail for now, but Snake Wilson was nothing if not persistent. Mason had spent 6 months hunting these men, determined to bring them to justice for Sheriff Grady's murder. Now he had an eyewitness who could testify against them, pregnant, vulnerable, and completely dependent on him for protection. He sighed, checking his ammunition. 3 days to the settlement, then another 2 to Fort Benton, where Violet said her sister lived. If they could make it, she'd be safe, and he could resume his pursuit with the help of additional lawmen. It was well past noon when Violet stirred, her face contorting in pain as she tried to sit up. "Easy," Mason said, helping her. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been trampled by a herd of buffalo," Violet admitted with a weak smile. "But alive, thanks to you." Mason offered her more water and the last of his jerky. "We need to keep moving before nightfall. The gang will still be searching, and I'd rather put more distance between us." Violet nodded, though her expression betrayed her apprehension about more hours on horseback. "I'll manage. May I ask how far along you are?" Mason inquired as he helped her to her feet. "About 7 months, I think," Violet said, rubbing her lower back. It wasn't exactly planned. Mason nodded, understanding in his eyes. My sister has 5 children. I've some experience with expectant mothers, though I admit it's limited to fetching hot water and staying out of the way. This drew a genuine laugh from Violet, the sound brightening her tired features and causing Mason to smile in return. Your sister is fortunate to have your help, Violet said. She might disagree, Mason replied, his expression softening with fondness. Caroline says I'm about as useful as a screen door on a submarine when it comes to childbirth. They continued to exchange small talk as Mason prepared for departure, checking Sampson's tack and scanning their surroundings for any sign of pursuit. By the time they mounted up, the sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the landscape. This time, Mason positioned Violet more comfortably in front of him, supporting her with one arm while guiding Sampson with the other. They set off at a steady pace, avoiding open ground where possible and sticking to the cover of trees and rocky outcroppings. As dusk approached, Violet's discomfort became increasingly apparent. She tried to hide her pain, but Mason felt her tense against him with each contraction. We need to stop, he finally said, guiding Sampson toward a small clearing beside a narrow stream. You're in labor? No, Violet protested weakly. It's too early. It's just false pains. My sister had those with her first, Mason said gently. This isn't what that looks like. Fear crossed Violet's face. The baby can't come now. Not out here. Mason helped her dismount and settled her on a patch of soft grass. I know this isn't ideal, but babies don't much care for convenience. Let me check how far apart the pains are coming. After timing several contractions, Mason's concern grew. They were irregular, but increasingly frequent. Early labor, but progressing faster than he'd like given their circumstances. I think we have some time, he told Violet, trying to sound more confident than he felt. But we need to prepare. I'll gather wood for a fire and see if I can catch some fish for dinner. You rest. Violet nodded, her face pale but determined. I've helped deliver calves and foals. I know what to expect, more or less. That's more experience than I have, Mason admitted. But between the two of us, we'll manage. As Mason busied himself with preparations, he kept a watchful eye on Violet. She was stronger than she appeared, handling her contractions with quiet determination. But delivering a child in the wilderness with outlaws potentially on their trail was a nightmare scenario. He caught 2 small trout from the stream and cooked them over a carefully controlled fire, making sure the smoke was minimal. As they ate, Violet told him more about herself, how she'd grown up on a small farm in Missouri, married Thomas at 18, and moved west when he'd gotten the gold fever. He found enough dust to keep us in liquor and gambling debts, she said bitterly. Never enough for a proper home or supplies for the winter. What will you do in Fort Benton? Mason asked. My sister married a shopkeeper there. She's written offering me a place with them. Violet winced as another contraction gripped her. I never replied. Too proud, I suppose. But now I don't have much choice. There's no shame in accepting help when you need it, Mason said quietly. Violet studied him in the firelight. Is that why you became a marshal? To help people? Mason stared into the flames, memories of Sheriff Grady flickering through his mind. I became a marshal because a good man believed I could be more than the troublemaking kid I was. He gave me purpose when I had none. And the Black Snake gang killed him, Violet guessed. Mason nodded. 6 months ago in Silver Creek. Shot him down in cold blood during a bank robbery. I'm sorry, Violet said, reaching out to touch his hand briefly. He sounds like he was important to you. He was the closest thing to a father I ever had, Mason admitted, surprised by his own openness. My real father abandoned us when I was young. Grady caught me trying to steal his horse when I was 16. Instead of throwing me in jail, he gave me a job and eventually convinced me to put my skills to better use. Their conversation continued into the night, interrupted periodically by Violet's contractions. As they shared stories, Mason found himself drawn to her quiet strength and the way she faced her circumstances with dignity despite her fear. For her part, Violet discovered that beneath Mason's rugged exterior was a man of principle and unexpected gentleness. By midnight, Violet's labor had intensified significantly. Mason helped her walk around the clearing between contractions, supporting her weight when the pains came. He boiled water in his small camp pot and laid out the cleanest cloths he had. I'm scared, Violet admitted as a particularly strong contraction subsided. What if something goes wrong? What if the outlaws find us? Mason cupped her face gently, meeting her eyes. One thing at a time. Right now, let's focus on bringing your baby safely into this world. I won't let anything happen to either of you. The intensity in his gaze reassured her more than his words. Despite having known him less than a day, Violet trusted Mason Northcott with her life and that of her child. As dawn approached, Violet's labor reached its peak. Mason positioned himself to help, his face a mask of concentration despite his nervousness. I can see the head, he told her, voice steady. One more big push, Violet. You can do this. With a final, tremendous effort, Violet pushed, and seconds later a new cry joined the sounds of the forest as Mason caught the newborn in his waiting hands. You have a daughter, he said, his voice thick with emotion. A beautiful little girl. Mason quickly cleaned the infant and wrapped her in his spare shirt before placing her in Violet's waiting arms. The look of wonder on Violet's face as she gazed at her daughter made something shift inside Mason's chest. She's perfect, Violet whispered, tears streaming down her face. Hello, little one. I'm your mama. Mason busied himself with the afterbirth and making Violet as comfortable as possible, but his eyes kept returning to the tableau of mother and child. In the midst of danger and uncertainty, this miracle had unfolded, reminding him of why his work mattered, why bringing men like Snake Wilson to justice was worth any risk. As the sun rose fully, bathing the clearing in golden light, Mason reluctantly brought up their situation. We need to move as soon as you're able. It's not safe to stay in one place too long. Violet nodded, though exhaustion was evident in every line of her body. I understand. Just give me a little time to recover. Of course, Mason said, checking his rifle. I'll scout the area, make sure we're still alone. He had just returned from his perimeter check when the sound of breaking twigs reached his ears. Mason immediately dropped to a crouch, motioning for Violet to stay silent. She clutched her newborn daughter closer, fear replacing the joy that had been on her face moments before. I know they came this way, a harsh voice said from the trees. Look at those tracks. Could be anyone, another man argued. We've been chasing shadows for hours. Snake wants the woman, the first voice insisted. Says she can identify us for that business in Helena. Mason counted at least 3 distinct voices. Not the entire gang, but enough to pose a serious threat. He moved silently to Violet's side. Can you stand? He whispered. Violet nodded, though her face had gone pale. If I must. There's a small cave about 50 yards downstream, Mason told her. Saw it during my scout. Get there and hide. I'll lead them away and circle back for you. But you'll be outnumbered, Violet protested. I'll have surprise on my side, Mason said with more confidence than he felt. Go now, while they're still searching. Move quietly. Violet hesitated only a moment before gathering her daughter and carefully rising to her feet. The pain must have been intense, but she made no sound as she crept toward the stream, staying low and using the underbrush for cover. Once she was safely away, Mason positioned himself behind a large boulder and fired a shot into the air. Immediately, the outlaws' voices ceased, followed by the sound of guns being drawn. That way, one shouted, and Mason heard them moving toward his position. He fired again, then quickly relocated, working to draw them away from Violet's escape route. The outlaws returned fire, bullets splintering bark from trees and ricocheting off rocks near Mason's position. For nearly 20 minutes, the deadly game of cat and mouse continued. Mason managed to wound one of the outlaws, but the other 2 were closing in. He needed to end this and get back to Violet and the baby. Taking careful aim, Mason fired at the closest outlaw, hitting him in the shoulder. The man fell with a cry, his gun discharging harmlessly into the ground. The second outlaw, seeing his companion down, hesitated just long enough for Mason to line up another shot. The bullet caught the man in the thigh, sending him crashing to his knees. Both outlaws were now incapacitated, but alive, able to stand trial for their crimes if Mason could get them to the nearest lawman. After quickly binding their wounds and securing them to trees with their own belts, Mason retrieved Samson and headed downstream to find Violet. The cave was little more than an indentation in the rock face, easily missed if you weren't looking for it. Violet, he called softly, approaching cautiously. "Here," came her weak reply from within the shadows. Mason found her huddled against the back wall, the baby clutched protectively to her chest. Both were pale, but unharmed. "The Outlaws?" Violet asked. "Wounded and restrained," Mason replied, kneeling beside her. "But we need to move quickly. The rest of the gang could be nearby." Violet attempted to stand, but swayed dangerously. Mason caught her, alarmed by the heat radiating from her skin. "You're feverish," he said, concern sharpening his voice. "I'll be fine," Violet insisted, though her eyes were unnaturally bright. "We need to go." Mason knew she was right, but he also knew the dangers of childbed fever. He had to get her to proper medical care as soon as possible. "I'm going to put you and the baby on Samson," he decided. "I'll walk alongside. We'll head straight for the settlement rather than trying to evade pursuit." It was a risk, but staying put was an even greater danger. Mason fashioned a sling for the baby from his bandana, securing the infant to Violet's chest before helping them both onto the horse. Then, leading Samson by the reins, he set a steady pace eastward. Throughout that day, Mason pushed them as hard as he dared. Violet's fever continued to rise, and by evening, she was barely conscious, clinging to the saddle horn while Mason supported her from below. The baby, miraculously, remained quiet, as if sensing the gravity of their situation. As twilight fell, the outline of buildings appeared on the horizon, the small settlement of Clearwater. Mason had never been so relieved to see ramshackle buildings and smoking chimneys. "Almost there," he told Violet, though he wasn't sure she could hear him through her fever. The settlement doctor, an aging man named Peterson, took one look at Violet and immediately cleared his examining table. "Childbed fever," he confirmed grimly after a brief examination. "How long since the birth?" "Just over a day," Mason replied, cradling the newborn while the doctor worked. "You delivered the child?" Peterson asked, eyebrows raised. "Had no choice," Mason said. "Will she recover?" The doctor's expression was guarded as he prepared a solution of willow bark and other herbs. "If we can break the fever within the next 12 hours, she has a chance." "The baby appears healthy, which is a blessing." For 3 days, Mason barely left Violet's side, helping the doctor bathe her in cool water and force medicinal teas between her cracked lips. When she became delirious, calling out for her dead husband or her distant sister, Mason held her hand and spoke soothingly until she quieted. He cared for the baby too, awkwardly at first but with increasing confidence. The tiny girl, whom Violet had named Sarah in a moment of lucidity, seemed to recognize him, quieting when he held her. On the 4th day, Violet's fever finally broke. She awoke disoriented but clear-eyed to find Mason asleep in a chair beside her bed, Sarah nestled in the crook of his arm. The sight brought tears to her eyes. "Mason," she whispered, her voice hoarse. He awakened instantly, relief washing over his face when he saw her. "Welcome back," he said softly, adjusting Sarah in his arms. "You had us worried." "Us?" Violet asked with a weak smile. "Your daughter is quite the taskmaster," Mason said, carefully transferring the sleeping infant to Violet's arms. "Very particular about her feeding schedule. The doctor found a wet nurse, but she prefers to be held by me between meals." Violet's heart swelled at the tenderness in Mason's voice. "Thank you for saving us. Both times." "It was my honor," Mason replied sincerely. "Besides, I've grown rather fond of you both." Over the next week, as Violet regained her strength, Mason made arrangements to transport her and Sarah safely to Fort Benton. He also sent telegrams to neighboring settlements, alerting the law about the captured outlaws and the rest of the Blacksnake gang, who were still at large. The night before they were set to depart for Fort Benton, Mason found Violet sitting on the doctor's porch, Sarah sleeping peacefully in her arms. The setting sun cast a warm glow over them, and Mason was struck by how right they looked together, how complete. "May I join you?" he asked. Violet nodded, making room for him on the bench. "I was just thinking about what comes next." Mason sat beside her, his arm brushing hers. "Your sister in Fort Benton?" "Yes," Violet confirmed. "Though the prospect doesn't fill me with joy. Margaret means well, but she's always been quick to judge. She'll take us in, but I'll never hear the end of how foolish I was to marry Thomas." Mason was quiet for a moment. "There are other options." Violet turned to look at him, curiosity in her eyes. "Such as?" I have a small ranch outside of Silver Creek, Mason said, suddenly nervous. Nothing fancy, but the house is solid and there's good grazing land. I haven't spent much time there since taking up the Marshal's badge, but with Snake Wilson and his gang nearly brought to justice. He trailed off, unsure how to continue. Violet waited, her heart beating faster. What I'm trying to say, Mason finally continued, is that I care for you, Violet. For both of you. I know it's sudden and perhaps improper to speak of such things so soon after your husband's passing, but life out here has a way of stripping away pretense. Are you proposing Marshal Northcott? Violet asked softly. Mason met her gaze directly. I suppose I am, though I'd understand if you need time to consider. I'm not a wealthy man, and my profession comes with risks. But I promise to be a good husband to you and a father to Sarah, if you'll have me. Violet was quiet for so long that Mason began to fear he'd overstepped. Then she reached out and took his hand in hers. When Thomas died, I thought my life was over, she said quietly. I had nothing but a baby on the way and nowhere to go. Then I literally fell into the worst possible situation, and you appeared like something from a dream, risking your life for a woman you didn't even know. She looked down at Sarah, sleeping peacefully. In the past week, I've watched you with her so gentle and patient. I've seen the kind of man you are, Mason Northcott. And I think I'd be a fool to look for better. Hope bloomed in Mason's chest. Is that a yes? It's a yes, Violet confirmed with a smile. Though we'll need to visit my sister eventually. I did promise, after all. Mason laughed softly, his relief evident. We'll go as soon as you and Sarah are strong enough for the journey. And then we'll go home to our home. As the last light of day faded from the sky, Mason gently pulled Violet and Sarah into his arms, marveling at how close he'd come to missing this chance at happiness. He had set out to bring criminals to justice, and instead had found a family, something he'd never known he was missing until now. 2 years later, the Northcott Ranch flourished under their joint care. Mason had resigned his marshal's badge, focusing instead on raising horses and cattle. Snake Wilson and his gang had been brought to justice with the help of Violet's testimony, closing that chapter of their lives. Violet stood on the porch of their expanded home, watching as Mason taught Sarah to sit on her first pony, the little girl's delighted laughter carrying across the yard. Her hand rested on her swollen belly, where their second child grew strong. Again, Papa, Sarah called as Mason led the gentle pony in a circle. One more time, Mason agreed with a grin, his eyes meeting Violet's across the yard. In that moment, surrounded by the life they had built together, Violet thought of that desperate day when she had stumbled, pregnant and afraid, into an outlaw camp. How close she had come to death, and how miraculous her rescue had been. Sometimes the greatest blessings came from the darkest moments. And sometimes, a single act of courage could change the course of multiple lives forever. As Mason brought Sarah up to the porch for her midday meal, Violet welcomed them with open arms, gratitude filling her heart for the family she had never expected to find and the love that had carried her safely home.